Wow.
I am Associate Dean Elizabeth Keys. I'm here for LaVonda Reed, our dean, who was not able to be here today, but I'm really excited about this partnership, about the chance to have this kind of interdisciplinary intellectual conversation about a critical issue. And I'm particularly, and I should say thank you to our partners, and also thank you to Professor Tuko Haridi for her role in organizing this for University of Baltimore. So my only job tonight, thankfully, is to introduce Dr. Eric Wargatz, and this is going to be a treat. He's one of my new favorite people. We're old friends from 5 minutes ago. He's a doctor from Queen Anne's County and became the 178th president of MedChi, the Maryland State Medical Society, just last October. He is a physician, a judge, and a seasoned C-suite executive, that I stole from your bio, whose work spans medicine, law, government, and business. It truly would take a long time to read all of his accomplishments, so I'm choosing my favorite representative sample of things to highlight, just to give you a sense of the breadth of his career. Dr. Wargatz is a member of numerous medical associations and a life member of the American Medical Association. He's the senior staff pathologist at Luminous Health Doctors Community Medical Center in Lanham, Maryland. He's clinical professor emeritus, we all aspire to emeritus, of pathology at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, where he won a teaching award. He's a judge as well, judge of the Orphans Court for Queen Anne's County. He's a past member of the Queen Anne's County Board of County Commissioners. He has a bachelor's in biological sciences from Rutgers, and he got his medical degree from the Ohio State University College of Medicine. He completed residency training in pathology at George Washington University Medical Center and the VA in Washington, D.C., where he served as chief resident. But his bio also mentions a nascent interest in acting and guitar. I did not ask him for details, but I assure you he'll be happy to address that in his remarks. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Keys. Good evening and welcome to this inaugural forum between the University of Baltimore School of Law and MedChi Center for a Healthy Maryland, a 501c3 organization. Please consider us in your charitable giving so that we may continue supporting programs like this tonight. We recognize Carol Allen and Dr. Thomas E. Allen in the audience tonight, who've made this program possible through their generous contribution to the center. Just so happens Mr. Ransom, CEO of MedChi, is here with us tonight, and he is a graduate of the University of Baltimore School of Law. So we certainly want to recognize the product of this university. So this gathering is a scholarly dialogue, a rigorous professional exchange between legal and medical communities. It's focused on navigating our shared professional landscape. My brief thoughts: vaccination is the ultimate humble recognition of our shared fragility, a personal act of trust in science that allows us to surrender our personal autonomy to the collective, a weave of individual bodies into a resilient collective shield, a philosophical handshake, if you will, where we accept microscopic risk to weave a tapestry of immunity, transforming individual vulnerability into communal invincibility, proving that our freedom is ultimately inseparable from our responsibility to one another. Whether vaccination mandates are ethical is the topic we are discussing tonight. Thank you all for being here. To lead this conversation, I am honored. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, my friend and colleague, Dr. David Hexter, a board-certified emergency physician with over 30 years of experience at Kaiser Permanente. Dr. Hexter is a past president of MedChi and the current chair of the Committee on Ethics and Judicial Affairs. His leadership ensures the ethical integrity and educational excellence of our collective mission at MedChi. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Hexter.
Dr. David Hexter. My God. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Wargods. And good evening and welcome, everybody. The Committee on Ethics and Judicial Affairs is pleased to present tonight's program, which is a collaborative effort between MedChi and the University of Baltimore School of Law, and we hope this is the first of many. Bringing together medical and legal experts to talk through ethical issues in healthcare creates an opportunity for meaningful interdisciplinary dialogue. By learning from each other's perspectives, we can better understand the challenges we face and take away practical insights that will apply in both legal and clinical settings. Tonight, we introduce a topic that illustrates that basic tension between individual liberty and the common good. As was espoused by a very famous U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1905, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which we will hear a lot more about tonight. We look forward to learning more about the challenges in communicating the benefits of vaccination to the public and to our patients, as well as identifying and describing key legal considerations when requiring vaccines. And with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist. Would you bring up our first panelist, who is here tonight, Dr. Nicole Cimino-Fiallos, who is presenting to us virtually from Honduras. Is that impressive or what? She is a board-certified emergency physician at Kaiser Permanente and currently serves as Assistant Physician-in-Chief for Quality, Risk, and Patient Safety for the Baltimore service area. In this role, she leads large-scale quality initiatives that translate evidence into operational workflows to improve vaccine uptake across diverse clinical settings. Drawing on her frontline experience and system-level leadership in quality and patient safety, Dr. Cimino-Fiallos focuses on practical, scalable strategies that drive measurable improvement in vaccine uptake. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cimino-Fiallos.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my slides. So as Dr. Hexter said, my name is Nicole Cimino-Fiallos. I'm board certified in emergency medicine. I work for the Mid-Atlantic Permanente Medical Group, which is partnered with Kaiser Permanente, and I am the Assistant Physician-in-Chief for Quality, Risk, and Patient Safety in Baltimore. And I'd like to thank Dr. Hexter and MedChi for inviting me to speak tonight. I do not have any relevant financial disclosures. I did want to throw in a little inside joke for those 80s kids that played Oregon Trail back in the olden days before vaccines. So I want to start tonight by talking about how I came to this work. I was in the emergency department. I spent years caring for patients at their sickest, and I now lead the quality arm of a large healthcare organization focused on prevention and vaccination in Baltimore. This shift from reacting to illness to preventing it has shaped how I think about ethics, communication, and our responsibility to patients and communities. In the ER, we see the downstream consequences of missed prevention. We see illnesses that didn't have to happen. Many vaccine preventable diseases show up as emergencies. Over time, I've realized that preventing these visits is just as important to patient safety as the things I do in the resuscitation bay. I would like to share a few stories tonight to help us remember what is at stake when it comes to vaccines. This is my youngest daughter, Ava. When Ava was 28 days old, she got RSV and had a prolonged hospitalization. There was no RSV vaccine when I was pregnant or when Ava was born, but I'm happy to report there is a vaccine now. My goals for tonight are listed here. First, I'd like to help us understand the ethical challenges that surround vaccination in modern medical practice. And second, I'd like to talk about how we're developing better ways to communicate vaccine benefits to patients and the public, especially in an era of mistrust and misinformation. These conversations about vaccines and vaccine mandates sit at the intersection of several principles of ethics, including autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Vaccination uniquely challenges us because decisions made by the individual can directly affect the health of others, particularly the most vulnerable. As clinicians, we respect autonomy, but autonomy isn't absolute when individual decisions place others at risk. Herd immunity protects infants, cancer patients, and the immunocompromised. Ethically, we must balance our respect for individual choice with our duty to protect public health. Misinformation causes real harm. Ethically, we are obligated to correct falsehoods while maintaining trust with our patients. The challenge is doing this without alienating our patients, especially when misinformation is tied to identity, fear, and prior negative interactions with the healthcare system. The spread of misinformation is not just a nuisance, it's a threat to patient safety that can lead to delayed treatment, the rejection of evidence-based care, and actual physical harm. From an ethical standpoint, healthcare providers have an obligation to correct inaccuracies to ensure informed consent and optimal outcomes. But this responsibility has to be balanced against the need to preserve the therapeutic alliance between patients and their physicians. As a quality leader, I see vaccination as a patient safety intervention. Our healthcare organizations have a responsibility to support clinicians with clear guidance, consistent messaging, and systems that make doing the right thing easy for both patients and staff. I'd like to share another story. When I was pregnant, I was working in an emergency department. I went to see a patient who was visiting from another state. She had not gotten any of the recommended vaccinations and came to the ER for a rash and a fever. I had never seen this rash before in person, but after phoning a friend, which was another ER attending with more gray hair than me, I learned this rash was chickenpox, and I panicked. I had gone to see this patient without even wearing a mask. Thankfully, my baby was born without any complications, but this exposure put me and my baby at risk for congenital varicella syndrome, which can happen when a pregnant mom is infected with chickenpox, and it can lead to serious birth defects like skin scarring, limb deformities, cataracts, and brain development issues. We often assume that giving patients more data will help them to change their minds about vaccination, but my experience tells us otherwise. In the ER, I learned that fear, emotion, and trust drive decisions far more than statistics. Vaccine communication must start with listening, not lecturing. The way we listen is with empathy. We listen to patients' concerns, acknowledge them, and frame vaccination as a protective act rather than a mandate. This approach preserves dignity and keeps the door open, even if the patients aren't ready to vaccinate today. At Kaiser, we normalize vaccination as the standard of care. We use phrasing like, "We recommend this vaccine for all patients like you." We share our clinical experience carefully, not with fear-mongering, but with compassion. We address myths briefly and redirect to trusted information, like our clinical guidelines and like those of the American Academy of Pediatrics. We know that a respectful confrontation can lead to acceptance either today or later on. Right now, we're experiencing the consequences of under-vaccination in a population. Flu cases are surging in Maryland hospitals, and we're seeing those effects throughout our healthcare system. Every flu season, the ER fills with patients who are elderly, pregnant, or chronically ill. Many of them are unvaccinated against the flu. There's a myth that the flu is benign, but it isn't. We like to frame the vaccine as a way to stay out of the hospital and protect family members because this resonates far more with patients than abstract risk statistics. I know we all remember the COVID-19 pandemic. I still remember the day that I got my first COVID-19 vaccine. I had my shirt sleeve rolled, my arm stuck out. I was ready for this gift from science. Many people chose not to vaccinate against COVID-19, even once the vaccine was available. And this led to preventable ICU admissions, delayed care for others, and clinician burnout. I myself left the ER quite crispy. I still remember the day we ran out of ventilators at my hospital. Vaccination wasn't just about individual protection, it was about preserving healthcare capacity. Ethically, protecting the system protects everyone. We know at Kaiser that using one clinician talking to one patient at a time isn't enough. Systems must support consistent messaging, train staff in vaccine conversations, and align quality metrics with prevention goals. Trust is built through repetition, consistency, and credible messengers. As an ER doctor, I learned how to save lives in crisis. As a quality leader, I've learned that preventing those crises is even more important. Vaccination is ethical care, high-quality care, and compassionate care. Our responsibility is to lead with empathy, evidence, and trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Graber, who is a distinguished university professor and Regents professor at the University of Maryland, and one of the nation's leading scholars in constitutional law and constitutional governance. His work focuses on how constitutional structures, legal institutions, and political incentives operate in practice, particularly during periods of crisis and reform. A former Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development, Professor Graber brings a deeply institutional and operational perspective to constitutional law, examining how legal frameworks are implemented, adapted, and enforced within a real-world system. He is the author of numerous influential books and articles, including Punish Treason, Reward Loyalty, and Constitutional Democracy in Crisis. Please join me in welcoming Professor Graber to share his insights.
Thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a little unusual for me. My specialty is 19th century American constitutional development, so I'm very used to speaking before empty rooms. Tonight, you will learn that I share something with the greatest legal minds in the history of the United States, which is I know nothing about vaccines. But fortunately, what I hope to convince you of is these great legal minds actually developed a legal structure for judging vaccines that could be operated by lawyers who knew nothing about vaccines. And this structure in the last few years may be threatened by another group of lawyers who, like me and like their ancestors, know nothing of vaccines. It begins with something called the police power, a concept developed by American lawyers in the first part of the 19th century. To understand police power's jurisprudence, it's worth going back to what for me was high school or junior high school, a basic political philosophy a lot of us learn that's behind government in the United States, or so people in the 19th century thought. This comes from John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, for that matter, Thomas Jefferson. I take it many people are familiar with the idea of a state of nature, that in this state of nature, John Locke said everybody is free to do whatever they want, but the problem is sometimes being free to do whatever I want harms you. You don't like that, so you harm me. And gradually everybody agrees that it's best to trade some of our natural liberties for a little security. And that's pretty much where the high school curriculum ends. It doesn't ask really what natural liberty do we trade. Now, it turns out everybody agreed nobody has a right in the state of nature to harm another person. The crucial feature in the state of nature and the fundamental right you had was I got to determine whether my actions were harming another person. If I thought I could drive 90 miles an hour down the highway and that wouldn't harm anybody, I could do it. If I thought not getting a vaccine would not harm anyone, I could do it. Of course, if you disagreed, you could try to force me to do it. We get into a fight, and that's why we want it out of the state of nature. What did we agree? We all agreed we would keep our natural right to exercise our liberty in any way that did not harm another person, but we would agree to create a common judge who would determine what constituted the common good, what actions harmed others, and we agreed to be guided by that common judge. So when 19th century lawyers spoke of the police power, what they meant was this was the power governments had to regulate for the health, safety, welfares, and morals of the community, that as long as government was regulating for the common good to prevent harms to others, no one could assert an individual right to the contrary. So if, unlike the Supreme Court, when you do gun regulation, you actually read history, it's one way of doing originalism, it's not the court's way. But if you read history, you discover the principle was very simple. If people thought a use of guns was overall harmful, you could regulate. Now, this didn't mean you had to regulate. It turns out people had very different ideas of whether guns were good or bad than we did, and often they didn't regulate, but everybody agreed. If government was regulating for the common good, government could do so, and nobody had an individual right to contest this. So if we look at 19th century cases, we discover the focus isn't on whether there's an individual right. The focus is on, is this for the common good? And this is a little trickier than we think, because people worried that what you couldn't do is you couldn't regulate my right just for the benefit of him. You could only regulate my right when it benefited the whole. And so government was suspicious. Is this what they would call class legislation? It's designed to harm one group of people for the benefit of another, or is this legislation for the common good? Have we singled out a particular class? So we've said only law professors have to get COVID shots, when there's no good reason to distinguish law professors from medical school professors. Those are the sorts of questions that get asked in the 19th century. And in the handout, Jacobson versus Maryland, you can see the way this plays out. Henning Jennings refuses to obey a Board of Health order to get a smallpox vaccine. And he says, it's an invasion of my body. If I have any right at all, it must be a right to my body. And Justice Harlan says, no. Have you not read your police powers? Have you not read your Locke? Because the police power says people may be regulated for the common good. People have no right to act in a way that injures others. The sole question we have is whether this is arbitrary. And Harlan does a two-part analysis. He says, one, what Massachusetts did is establish a board of health. And the board of health would determine whether vaccinations were necessary. And Harlan said, I'm no doctor, but common sense says, isn't this a reasonable way of doing it? Notice Harlan doesn't say it's the best way of doing it. He doesn't say they put the 5 people who know the most about public health on the board. He simply says that it looks like in establishing the board of health, they were trying to improve the common good. It says now the board of health looked at the evidence and said, you know what? We need vaccinations against smallpox. And notice it's very important. Harlan said, like Graber, who will come after me, I know nothing about vaccines. Here's what I know. I know there's a smallpox epidemic going on. I know that smallpox can be deadly. I know a lot of my doctor friends think that a vaccination might be good. Okay, some of my doctor friends may not think so. But enough of my doctor friends, enough of the medical community who I respect, believe vaccines are the right policy, that we, the lawyers who haven't got a clue, should defer to them. So this is what we inherited. And for a long time, this was the law, to the point where in I gave a vaccination question on an exam. South Dakota decides to vaccinate for the flu. Can they do it? The answer is yes, and anyone who wrote an answer longer than yes got points off. Also, saved me a lot of time grading. Then a new development occurred. It's a development that occurred before 2018. It's a development that's very good in many ways, but it's threatening vaccination. Remember, I told you in the 19th century, you could not assert an individual right against the common good. Post-World War II, we developed a very different notion of individual rights, summed up by a legal philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, who the law students should know, the medical people should know, and you need not know. But Ronald Dworkin said rights are trumps against policy. You cannot violate a right unless it is really necessary. So let's take an area many of us agree, free speech. 19th century, if I called you a name, I could be sued, I could be imprisoned, because calling people's names threatened the public peace, and the public could decide, little less free speech, little less fighting, good deal. Now the mere fact that I insult you, that might cause a fight, that's not good enough. We don't restrict free speech unless there is real danger of a very, very serious harm. We don't balance the scale. We put a big thumb on free speech. Well, you can now see what's going on with vaccination. Now the claim is that free exercise rights ought to be the same, that people ought to get exemptions because of their religious beliefs, unless it's really costly to the public. Now, this in itself does not threaten vaccines, since, as the previous speaker has pointed out, you can say, yep, but given the nature of COVID, given the nature of the flu, it's a real threat to the general public. It's not simply a small harm. We need to vaccinate people. But the Supreme Court, and particularly the more religious members of the Supreme Court who firmly believe, and this is, by the way, a belief of our contemporary Supreme Court, the most discriminated person in the United States are the members of the Supreme Court. If you look at their writings, they frequently, people like us are the most vulnerable, abused minority in the United States. And one proof is they want us to get vaccination shots. So here's the new rule. If you exempt anyone, you must exempt the religious believer. Notice the potential problem with that, which is there are some people we exempt because, in fact, they have a health condition. If we give them the shot, they'll die. And that seems a reasonable exemption. I take it that most people in this room would be for that exemption. Well, we've exempted the 15 people in the world who are allergic to the vaccine. Now, according to the Supreme Court, we may have to exempt 1 million people. And in particular, the doctrine is we do not examine your religious beliefs. I say God forbids me from paying taxes. That's my religious belief. Can't be examined. So if somebody decides, well, you know what? I've never believed this before, but I'm looking at that needle. It's kind of sharp. I just heard God say, don't take that prick. We take that seriously. And it requires the judges now to figure out how much harm will be caused by persons not taking the vaccine. And notice in the old schedule, the one of Justice Harlan, Harlan said, I'm not going to figure this out because nothing in law school prepared me to do public health. Here's what I know. The people in public health, a lot of them, think we've got to vaccinate pretty much everyone. Good enough for me. The court now is taking upon itself the expertise in public health. They haven't yet ruled that exemptions are mandatory for religious believers, though 4 justices are on record as believing that. But that is where we are going. The framework that has constructed vaccines from 1791 until approximately 2020 is in jeopardy, and I wish I could be more optimistic about its future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Greg Dolin, who is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law and nationally recognized expert in healthcare law, intellectual property, and regulatory policy, with a particular focus in the biopharmaceutical sector. Trained in both medicine and law, he brings a rare practical perspective on how legal and regulatory frameworks shape innovation, access, and implementation in healthcare. Professor Dolin's work examines how statutes, patent regimens, and administrative decision-making operate in practice, especially how policy choices affect real-world delivery of medical technology and public health interventions. He has provided congressional testimony, authored amicus briefs, and served as an associate justice on the Supreme Court of the Republic of Palau in the Pacific, correct?
Correct.
Weather's nice there.
Quite so.
Where he heard
During COVID.
where he heard constitutional and administrative law cases. We're pleased to welcome Professor Dolin to share his operational and legal insights on how regulatory structures influence health policy and public health implementation.
Thanks so much. It's always tough to follow Professor Graber, especially on matters of constitutional law. It's walking into a lion's den because he's been teaching it. Professor Graber has been teaching common law for, I'm not going to say how many years, but much longer than I have. I've taught it for about one semester before taking leave from the university and working for the Department of Justice, which is where I am now. So I should start with the usual disclaimer that nothing that I say can or should be attributed to my past, present, or any future employer, especially not to the DOJ. I was somewhat surprised that I was invited to participate in this. I'm very honored, but somewhat surprised, because usually kind of ethics is really not what I usually do. I suppose part of it was because I am the sort of the center-right person, and I guess I'm supposed to be, pounding the table and being a fire breather against vaccines and everything like that. I'm not going to go that far, but I'll try to be sufficiently controversial so we can have a discussion afterwards. So let me begin by, observing something that I think I've internalized beginning in law school and sort of more and more later on. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. There's not a problem in the world that actually has a solution. There's simply trade-offs. So we can have vaccinations at a cost of, violating somebody's religious freedom. We can honor somebody's religious freedom at a cost of not having everybody vaccinated and perhaps undermining herd immunity. That's it, right? There is no, nirvana is not for this world. Okay, so it's just, we as a society, we can decide what our trade-offs are. Right? And, we do this all the time in law, we do it all the time in medicine, right? We don't spend the entire hospital's budget on one patient, even though perhaps if we do, that patient will live, right? Why? Because there are trade-offs. If we do that, a bunch of other people will die, okay? So I think I can begin my remarks with that framework, that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And with that, so we can take a look at our more modern approach to constitutional law and to how we analyze whether or not vaccines should be mandatory and whether or not it's ethical to have vaccine mandates. Professor Graber was absolutely correct that kind of our sort of lodestar case is Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It's been cited countless times, and again, sort of in interest of full disclosure, I am one of those other new lawyers who've litigated against Jacobson versus Massachusetts over the last several years. Before joining the Department of Justice, I was, in addition to being a law professor here, I was senior counsel for New Civil Liberties Alliance, where we represented a number of people who got fired or otherwise disciplined for refusing to comply with vaccine mandates and had negative consequences to them. So we've tried to convince the court that Jacobson was both wrongly decided as well as has overtaken by subsequent cases and inapplicable to the COVID situation. So let me talk a little bit about Jacobson, because I think understanding the background of the case and and what was decided and the penalties imposed on Mr. Jacobson is important. Professor Graber was correct. This was done during the middle of the flare-up of smallpox, and Mr. Jacobson, as well as other people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, were required by the Board of Health to take a vaccine. He refused, and he was fined all of $5. Now, granted, this is the beginning of the 20th century, so $5 then is a significant amount of money. It's not $5 now, but nevertheless, it was not. He didn't lose his job. He didn't lose his livelihood. He was fined $5 and ultimately went to jail because he refused to pay the fine. But he wasn't jailed because he refused to take the vaccine. He was jailed because basically speaking, he was in contempt of court. But what's important about Jacobson are two things, I think. One is Jacobson predated our modern constitutional jurisprudence, which, again, as Professor Graber explained, where we do require really important government interests to be served if we're going to invade people's fundamental rights. And since about 1960s, if not earlier, we've recognized bodily autonomy and bodily integrity as a fundamental right, both in law and in medicine. I was born and grew up until about age 13 in the former Soviet Union, where just approach to medical ethics was very different, right? Patient consent was just not that important. And, if the patient was particularly ill, you didn't tell him what was wrong with them. Maybe you told the family so they could take care of them, and you just lied to the patient because the view was that that was better for them not to know that they may be dying, right? And that was the ethical approach. And we can debate whether or not that's a better approach or not, right? That was in some sense also an American approach up until like in the 19th century as well. We've moved past that. We now have a kind of a very different approach where we tell the patient everything. We expect the patient to make the decision, which sometimes is difficult. When I was in medical school training, one of the most frustrating situations was I did a fair amount of my rotations in a VA hospital. And so when, I was being trained, and so as a medical student, I had to go and like do the first conversation with the patient. And I'm sure many of you here are familiar with this dilemma. So I would go in and I say, well, we can do this and we can do that, et cetera. Like, what do you think? And every so often the response I would get, when I was on the beach of Normandy, I didn't ask you how to fight the Nazis. It's like, this was my job and this is your job. Why are you asking me, right? Because a lot of them grew up with this idea that the doctor decides, right? The doctor is this demigod who gives you the decision and you just follow it, right? And I saw it also firsthand when I was already in legal practice. A judge that I clerked for, he was a former Navy man, and he was unfortunately during my clerkship diagnosed with cancer. And he said, like, well, my doctor told me to do this, and by golly, I'm going to do it because that's an order, right? From a superior officer, we're going to do it. But generally speaking, we don't do this anymore, right? We ask for patient autonomy, we ask for patient decision-making, and we follow that even if we as physicians think that, patient is wrong or making a bad choice. And so Jacobson predates all of that. Jacobson predates our constitutional structure of having government justify its intervention on those individual rights. Second, Jacobson, if you sort of try, and like I said, I've litigated specifically COVID cases, not vaccines generally, but COVID cases specifically. Jacobson was a different case factually. At that time, now again, whether it was actually true or not, but at that time, everyone agreed, both Jacobson and the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that the vaccine was, to use the modern parlance, a sterilizing vaccine. So once you got a vaccine from smallpox, you did not get smallpox disease. That, of course, is just not true when it comes to COVID. Now, this is not to say that COVID vaccine doesn't have benefits, that you may have a milder form of disease and you may not overload the healthcare and ICUs. So this is not to say that COVID vaccine is useless, but it is a different type of vaccine and gives you different, benefits, as both to you as well as to society in general. So people who have been vaccinated still get COVID. They can still pass along COVID, etc. And so I think that's an important should be an important part of the analysis in figuring out whether or not, at least with respect to those types of vaccines, the state can carry its burden. And number three, about Jacobson, Jacobson is not a particularly, how should I put it? Jacobson progeny, let's say, is not much to be proud about. Jacobson has been cited most prominently in one case by, so when I was writing my briefs, I've actually tried to look kind of like what case have cited Jacobson. And Supreme Court hasn't really, up until COVID era, did not cite Jacobson all that much, except in one case by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And of course, I'm going to forget the case name because I'm terrible with case names. I can only remember case facts, but I'm sure you'll help, right?
Well, depends on the case.
It's a case where Justice Oliver, basically there was a institutionalized woman.
Buck v. Bell.
Buck v. Bell. Thank you very much. So Buck v. Bell. So Carrie Buck was an institutionalized woman. She, the warden of her institution sought to sterilize her because supposedly she was feeble-minded, as was supposedly was her mother. And so she said, like, well, we shouldn't have, a feeble-minded person bear a child. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said in Jacobson says, it's for public good because, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, right? One of the more infamous quotes in U.S. reports. So, people who rely on Jacobson should at least be aware kind of where Jacobson has led, okay? So I think taking that prism, we should at least recognize that there are significant costs to vaccine mandates. And when we analyze whether or not we should give exemptions to whether it's religiously minded people or people who are skeptical about the science or whatever else, I think we should recognize that there are these costs about invading people's freedom. Now, all of this having been said, I'm, in many ways, I'm in agreement with the prior two speakers. So, for example, I fully believe that truth telling is important, right? And that we should tell the truth to the patients, and we should tell them what are the latest advances in science, and we should hopefully guide them to the right solution. But ultimately, the decision ought to be theirs. And not to completely relitigate the COVID era, which I totally get. People were trying to do the best they could with a very limited information, a very fast-moving environment. And so I'm not here to blame anyone for the mistakes that were made, but nevertheless, it's important to remember that it was not true. Again, I'm not saying it was an outright lie that was made with a knowledge that it was a lie. But it was not true, for example, that COVID vaccines provided more protection than naturally acquired immunity from COVID disease. And yet people were forced to have COVID vaccine, even if they had COVID beforehand, beyond that theory that it gives you more immunity, not just to you, but to the public at large. And that was simply not true. It was not true that the vaccines were sterilizing vaccines. They weren't. Again, was this as purposefully misleading statement? Maybe not purposefully, but it was simply not true. And so truth telling, I think, is important. And we should also, when situations call for it, tell the patients that our knowledge in certain areas is limited. And I'll close with a couple of observations. Again, I completely agree with our first speaker that, look, many choices when it comes whether to vaccinate or not result in, or choice not to vaccinate results in emergencies, and that's not a good thing. And, I completely agree that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That said, many choices in other areas result in emergencies. People overeating result in emergencies, being brought to the hospital for heart attacks or strokes. People, people smoking, doing that. People doing drugs result in that. And yet, for example, there are movements to decriminalize drugs. One of the most bizarre things that I've seen kind of in my not very long life is, complete sort of societal rejection of smoking tobacco happening at the exact same time as complete societal acceptance of smoking marijuana. It's kind of like, it goes like this. When I was in college, everybody smoked in bars. That was kind of the thing you did, right? You went to bar, you drank, and you smoked, right? And hopefully met someone, right? That was the deal, right? And now I go to a bar and it's great. I don't have to come home and shower myself in vinegar to get that smoke out and spend enormous amounts of money on dry cleaning. It's great. But at the same time, I walk down the street and like in DC, everything smells of pot. It's weird, right? And so those choices result in also healthcare expenditures, right? So decreasing smoking results in lower healthcare expenditure, but the increase in pot results in higher healthcare expenditures. And yet we have arguments for legalizing more drugs, which as a sort of libertarian, I'm somewhat sympathetic to, right? But recognizing that there are costs to that as well, right? And equally, similarly, choices that we make outside of vaccine context also affect third parties. And not just, for example, smoking gives other people secondhand smoke and they have to do this because, again, at least in closed environments, we have less and less of that. But even, for example, again, going back to overeating, it may result in early death, which may affect families, right? Including in medical ways, not just financial, but depression, grief from losing your father, brother, mother, sister, etc. So in that sense, vaccines are not unique. And we should recognize that merely saying, well, this choice affects others is not a unique circumstance. And I will simply end where I began. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And the question is, how much do we value our religious liberty? How much do we value our personal autonomy? And also, of course, how much do we value public health? And I think your mileage may vary on all of those questions, but that, I think, is the debate that we should be having.
Thank you very much. Great talk, Dr. Dolin, and I would love to invite you to be a member of MedChi.
I am.
Oh, you are? That is awesome.
So,
Yeah. Here. So we will be taking questions live here in the audience, as well as questions that were sent in advance. And if you are online and would like to submit a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll ask as many as we can here. So here in the audience, we have a member of the Committee on Ethics and Judicial Affairs here with the first question, Joe.
In other words, the penalty was $5. They have a life sentence. What is the limit of police power to impose a penalty in case of finding
Presumably at some point, one, we trust, part of it at the start, I agree or don't disagree with about 19/20th of what he said. So we said, it's a trade-off.
Unexpected.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. My point was simply that what Jacobson really says is not that they made the best trade-off, but that judges are not the people who are best positioned to make the trade-off. So at some point, should it be $10? I still think there are people other than judges that could say $10, $15. Now, when you get to life imprisonment, execution, and by the way, we kick your dog as well, at this point, I think the judges can say, okay, what's going on here is no longer a program that any reasonable person could think was for the common good. This is a person of, we don't like these people and we want to hurt them. And it's a judgment, but notice it's a different judgment. Should it be $5, $10 a week in prison? It's at the point where it's so extreme, where you just say to yourself, what's going on here is not the common good. At least this is the perspective. If one wants to, think of what the framers of the country, how they would analyze, how it would have been analyzed until about 1960. And even, there's a longer thing I'll have on rights. Even here, at some point, a punishment is not for the common good, but it is simply to hurt people. And that is against our tradition.
I don't know if obviously there's also cruel and unusual punishment limits on that. So I think, although this court and not just this court, I think for several decades basically said, look, we don't do proportionality analysis. We don't say, okay, well, burglary cannot be more than 7 years, but if it's like, if you also were carrying a weapon, then basically they don't do it. The only time when they kind of get into that is when it comes to the death penalty, which is its own unique thing. But ultimately, I think, generally speaking, I think given that the court doesn't really get into this proportionality of punishment analysis, I think really the inquiry is going to be, is the regulation valid now? And the question then is, are we using the kind of the 19th century analysis with the common good analysis, or are we using the individual right analysis? And so, because depending on which lens you use, the burden on the government to justify its both the requirement and the punishment for violating that requirement is going to be very different.
I'd like to offer Nicole the opportunity if she has anything.
I was just thinking, I was like, this is probably outside of my scope because I'm not an attorney. So I'll pause for the next question, actually.
Okay, very good. We had another question over there.
So thank you very much. By the way, Typhoid Mary, spent the rest of her life in jail. So this does happen sometimes, and they needed to do it. But I'm a psychiatrist from Washington and Mark Graper's wife, so I hear about this a lot. And when I'm listening to this whole notion of trade-offs, which obviously I understand as a physician, seems to fall apart when you talk about what are you trading off. On one hand, there are people claiming I will be damned, or I will have sinned, or I'll do something immoral if I take this vaccine. And on the other hand, there's a saying, you're going to infect a lot of people and a lot of other people are going to get sick. And they're talking very different languages, that the trade-off is not based on the common principles, because people are living in different realities. And I don't see quite how the law necessarily can resolve that.
But I think that's true about most things, right? The trade-offs are not just kind of, look, $5 on this program, on building a bridge, or $5 on, on subsidizing school lunches. It's not always the trade-off in economics. Oftentimes the trade-offs are, perhaps economics on this end, but morality on that end, right? You could just say that, look, it might actually be cheaper to subsidize a particular program, or whether it's school lunches or whatever else, than not doing it, because kids will not go home hungry, and they'll be more, they'll do the homework because they're not going to be thinking about food, and they'll be more productive member of society, and all that other economic benefits. And there could be just some sort of moral objection to that, whatever that might be, as to why government should or should not be doing that. And they're not, you're right, you can't you can't weigh them against each other. My point is not that it's easy to kind of just plug it into a formula and say, okay, well, here's this trade-off, et cetera. This side wins and this side loses. It's merely to recognize that there's always costs. And the cost may be to an individual person who thinks that they'll be damned, but it's broader, right? It's what is our view and what is our protection of religious liberty? What is our view on our protection of bodily autonomy? So it's not just dollars and cents on both sides. In some sense, it's dollars and cents and values and all the other things that we think as society are important.
I wanted to.
Okay, yeah, let's go in.
Go ahead,
I wanted to just kind of speak to my view of trade-offs, and I agree with the questioner's comment of we kind of feel like we're living in different realities. So many times when I'm talking to patients and their families about vaccinations, we're not speaking the same language. I'm speaking, medical benefits, things that I see in practice, and they're speaking things they've heard on specific news channels, things that are not coming from medical literature. And so it's hard to kind of have that discussion. And when I think of trade-offs, again, I go back to anecdotes where during COVID-19, when the vaccine became available, people were choosing not to vaccinate. And my grandmother was in a nursing home and her nursing aide was not vaccinated against COVID. My grandmother contracted COVID and she died. My daughter, when she got RSV, she was too young to get vaccinated, or there was no vaccine. But now someone could contract RSV from someone who was unvaccinated and, could get very sick from that. And so it's really hard to, as a medical professional who strongly believes in vaccines, it's really hard to weigh a near zero risk with the potential effect of someone dying or having a prolonged hospitalization or being permanently disabled from an infection. For example, the HPV vaccine has never had a death attributed to it. It has very low side effects. And someone could contract HPV, give it to someone else, and give them a head and neck cancer or a cervical cancer. And so it's hard for me to talk about trade-offs when I see vaccines as generally benign versus the illnesses that they prevent can be very life-threatening.
Thank you.
Go ahead. It's worth distinguishing when we say the law can't decide among incommensurable. In one sense, the real question that the law decides is who legally gets to make that decision. So legislatures all the time allocate between incrementals. Are we going to buy a road? Build a road, build a hospital. Right? There's not a common denominator. What traditionally we tried, and this is what Jacobson is about, it's not about whether the vaccine is good, whether they're right about it. It's about, there are trade-offs here, and we think another body, could be the board of the medical school, we think another body is better able to make the trade-offs in a way that will maximize the common good and reflect popular sentiment. We should be careful, by the way, when we talk about individual right. So there's a debate in American law as to whether, for example, your free exercise right, it's very clear that it stands for a couple of things. No one can force you to be a Catholic against your will. No one can ban you from lighting candles on Shabbat when you do so for a religious reason, when everyone else is allowed to light candles because isn't a candlelight dinner romantic? The government can't say, in other words, won't allow you to light the candles for religious reason, but you can do the same exact act if you're just having a romantic dinner. But it's quite contested, and I think the historical evidence strongly against, that your religious freedom consists of a right to say, this act everybody else has to do because it's illegal, but my religion forbids it. So there's a question, one, whether there's an individual right. If there is an individual right not to get pricked by somebody else, is there also an individual right not to be infected by somebody else? After all, in some ways, the virus works exactly the way a vaccine works. It's a foreign body that comes from somebody else and comes to me. So part of the reason why these have historically not been considered individual rights is it's very different to sterilize a person, where whatever harm is coming to another person is speculative in the future, and where one person says, you can't prick my body, so I can have unlimited capacity to prick other people's bodies.
Thank you. There's a question here in the front.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I have so many questions, but I do want to talk to what Dr. Nicole talked about, the credible messenger and the common good, and who chooses what the common good is depends on the credible messenger of the data. But this goes to this speaking to the community as making the decisions for themselves within a community, of a religious community or inner city Baltimore community, with the rights of my community is my mother. Okay, my community is my grandmother. My community is somebody I love. But if I speak on the masses, there are people that I don't know. There are people that, their common good is different than my common good, because it's deliberated by the community. So this is where I get to the lawyers part of it, because I love it. I remember when I was a resident, when a lawyer came to speak to us at a CME, and he said, lawyers know medicine better than doctors do. And that spoke to me. And I thought, well, maybe I need to go to law school to be a doctor, right? So you guys are making decisions on these mandates at a federal level, but our community is states now. We're facing MedChi legislation this year about what Maryland can do in case the federal law does one thing and tells us something that's not necessarily the common good in our credible messengers in this state. If you understand anything that I'm saying right now, somebody shake their head. What I'm wondering is, can we do in the state we're in right now with mandates, can we do something in Maryland to protect our common good in Maryland if it's not the common good in Texas or Virginia or Florida?
Before I let the lawyers tear into that question, I just wanted to make a few comments, and I do appreciate the question. The first comment I would like to make is, in religious communities, children are not moral extensions of their parents, and they should have a right to health and avoiding preventable illnesses. And then secondly, I'm glad that you brought up inner city Baltimore, because I think we need to acknowledge that some people's individual rights in this country seem to matter more than other people's individual rights. and the choices we make with those rights affect us differently. So patients in Baltimore, or where I used to work out in Western Maryland, that got COVID-19 and got really sick from it, didn't have access to ventilators, didn't have access to the top medical care because we were so overstretched and because so many people needed us. Whereas when the president got COVID-19, I'm sure he got a much higher level of attention and care. And so I just want to highlight that these decisions don't impact all communities in the same way. And some people are much harder hit, especially those underprivileged and underserved, and those people that did have to go to work during the pandemic, and those people that didn't have money for great medical care. And so I just wanted to highlight those 2 points as we move forward talking about what Maryland can do.
I went first last time.
Okay. No, I think here the notion in law, which is a good one, is jurisdiction. Maryland, the Maryland legislature, governor of Maryland, have responsibility for the common good in Maryland. They don't for the common good in New Hampshire. We all have jurisdiction, say families. We have special responsibilities to our families. So we can see a lot of different circles going on, but historically, public health was a state responsibility. Now it's increasingly become a federal responsibility, and both Greg and I could talk your ears off for about 3 hours on all the debates going on about that. But the proposal I have historically was not that lawyers decided what was the common good, but that courts did say, these are the institutions that we've entrusted to determine the common good. They appear to be doing their job. The doctors at the Board of Health appear to be doing their job. We have to trust them.
I would, I guess I'll just take this opportunity. Perhaps it's not an indirect answer to the question, but also to point out that in many ways I agree with Mark that the question in many senses, like who decides? The legislatures, the Board of Health, the courts, etc. And generally speaking, as a believer in democracy, as a believer in kind of in having those trade-offs settled by debate and not by fiat, right? I'm a believer that probably legislatures are the best, or some sort of representative body, whether it's city council or the state legislature or whatever, they're probably the best to do it. That said, I think there's a role for the courts to ensure that legislatures don't, again, the legislative Board of Health, whoever is entrusted with doing it, that they don't, while looking out for common good, don't also trample on individual rights. I understand that, Texas might value might weigh things differently than Maryland does. And that's fine. That's the beauty of the United States and kind of in the federal system. And if you don't like it, you can vote with your feet and you can move to Texas or to Maryland, as the case may be. But that said, I think, I think we got to be just a bit more humility from everyone. Again, COVID is a perfect example. There were a lot of not only mistakes made, but there were just a lot of when we delegated some decision-making authorities to people, for example, who just did public health. And again, I'm not here to say, oh, Dr. Fauci did all sorts of terrible things or he did all sorts of great things. That's not the point. The point is Dr. Fauci and various boards of health, they had a particular view based on their expertise. And so that view was very much tunnel vision focused on public health. And that's right, because that's their expertise. But that didn't take into account, for example, things as to what would happen when you keep kids home from school for too long. Are they going to lose their math and language skills? And what is the cost of that? Right? And that goes back to the previous question. How do you weigh those costs? How do you weigh the cost of somebody's grandmother dying versus, kids falling behind? It's, they're not comparable, but there are costs. And so those are the costs we should debate in a democratic society. And again, I have a bit more humility that we don't know a lot. We can't have these individuals who know just public health decide on all these other policy issues that we got to get other people involved, whether it's educators, et cetera. And we do need some judicial involvement to make sure individual rights are protected. And I'll just add with this little caveat. We talked a few times about religious exemptions, et cetera. Most states, I think, right, by my last count was something like 46 states have religious exemptions from vaccination of all sorts of, whether it's measles, mumps, rubella, whatever. Only 4 don't. Up until, I think, 2021, 2022, New York had religious exemption. Now they don't. And they've abolished it with explicit reasons saying, the governor said, like, religious folks are kooky and crazy and we shouldn't tolerate that. That seems to be kind of a bad reason to do it, right? It's not all of a sudden, oh, we had this spike in this particular disease, et cetera. So like, we're a progressive state in the Northeast, we're blue, and we just don't like religious folks. That seems pretty bad reason to me, especially since for 80 years they were just fine with religious exemptions. So again, my pitch to you is not kind of like, look, no vaccines for anyone or vaccines for everyone. Those of you who are fans of The Simpsons from 1990s, one of my favorite episodes was played on the election eve 1996, where aliens take form of one of Bill Clinton and one of Bob Dole, but they don't really know how to campaign. And so one alien in the form of Bob Dole, he gets on a podium and says, abortions for all. And he gets booed. He's like, no abortions for anyone. And he gets booed. And then he's like, okay, well then, abortions for some, miniature American flags for others. And he gets cheered, right? That's my pitch to you, right? Like, I would just say that, look, it's not that we should do no vaccines for all or vaccines for none. It's that we should consider the cost of mandates on religious folks, on on ability of people to maintain their bodily integrity, on the fact that we may not have knowledge, especially about new vaccines like COVID vaccines, and what long-term sequelae might be. Maybe nothing, but some humilities that we don't know.
Thank you. I saw one in the back.
Hold on for the microphone. Thank you.
I have maybe a question and a question. So I was a little surprised to hear the point that smallpox vaccine is very different from COVID vaccine because COVID didn't prevent infection. But COVID vaccine prevented death very effectively. And I not forget, it's a piece that seems to get lost in the conversation. But my question is whether this is really about vaccines or is this about a broader public who decide what is the cost of kind of bring into the discussion, do we change our seatbelt mandates? Do we change our mandates against preventing secondhand smoke, which we already heard a comment that we probably shouldn't be inhaling marijuana secondhand smoke. So is there really a public health problem here? Is there something very specific about the COVID vaccine or about vaccines?
Thank you. Nicole, do you want to?
I hate that the discussion always goes back to COVID, but it seems to have really jump-started the idea of mandates. I think it's interesting that different vaccines divide people in different ways. And so the COVID vaccine divides people on their individual rights and not being injected by the government and that type of thing. The HPV vaccine comes up a lot because they think it encourages sexual behavior in children. Other vaccines come up because of concerns for religion. And it is interesting to me that other mandates for public safety don't have as much going against them. So I agree with you. I also agree that COVID-19 vaccination does prevent death. I've seen patients that were vaccinated get COVID. I've seen patients that were unvaccinated get COVID, and unvaccinated patients, in my experience, typically did worse. I would also add that it sometimes doesn't feel like a fair fight when we're talking about vaccines because so much of the misinformation coming out against vaccines is not grounded in science. And so it's very hard to have an educated discussion with lay people about vaccines because they aren't arguing on the same terms. And So yeah, so that's my thoughts there.
Comment.
It was mostly medical. I begun by saying what I have in common with great legal minds is I know nothing about medicine. I hope I've proven that.
That's fair. Same.
Yeah. Well, I know a little bit about medicine. You know.
You actually know something.
Okay, I saw a question right there. Oh, yeah. Dr. Allen, the sponsor of our talk tonight, will give you the floor.
Excellent panel discussion. Really very informative. My question is this, that one of the solutions that was proposed during the COVID pandemic was for children was to keep children home who were sick and only allow vaccinated children to come into schools. And in some ways that seemed like a reasonable way of doing it, but there was a lot of criticism of that. And I just wonder what you as a panel think about that that way of handling it, or that way that was handled.
Like, look, again, it's a trade-off thing, right? And so, especially in early stages of COVID, I think it's probably a plausible trade-off, especially when we knew very little about vaccines. We all hoped that these would be like traditional sterilizing vaccines. And look, cards on the table. I also got a vaccine as soon as I possibly could because I was really so I came back from Palau because my father was having health issues. And I was really hoping to get back there, and I got stuck with my parents. And at that point, my father was immunocompromised, and I was like living at home with him. And yeah, guess what? I was like, even though every so often, like my dad drove me nuts, I did not really want to kill him. So like, close, but not like, I was like, I wanted to kill him, but not permanently. Right. So, so I tried to get a vaccine as soon as I could because we shared the house and I was, right. And I got it because we all thought that this is going to be kind of one and done. And so that's going to defeat COVID and we'll all go back to our normal lives. Turned out not to be the case. Turned out that, we learned to live with COVID, and luckily, whether it's the disease is not as potent or our treatment is better or vaccine is helping or combination thereof. But my point is, like, at early stages of COVID, when we really didn't know, when we had parents or grandparents at home, and we didn't want kids to bring it back, and we didn't really know whether kids are better or worse carriers. It seems to me to be a reasonable compromise, saying, right, you're not going to jail, but at least until we kind of figure out what the hell is going on, kids who are not vaccinated don't get to come to school. Would the same thing be reasonable today? I would be more skeptical of it today. But again, the question ultimately is who decides and how much protection do we give to objectors and on what basis?
The Owl of Minerva.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Go.
Go, Nicole.
I choose to believe that people made the best decisions they had at the time with the information available. I think in the past, what we've done to protect children in schools is mandate vaccination for everyone attending. And so that's what they deferred to with this. I will say during COVID, there was this feeling that children were not at risk for serious complications. And I took care of the first pediatric death from COVID-19 in the state of Maryland. So although it was less risky, it seemed, I can understand why everyone was so fearful. And as someone pointed out in the chat, the teachers were concerned because many of them were older or immunocompromised. And so I think people did the best they could with the information they had at the time.
Oh, one of the things we do teach is the owl Minerva always flies at twilight, which the English translation is that by the time we figure out what's going on, it's too late. And to a fair degree, a lot of, we now know, for example, that some of the risks to school children were exaggerated. Not all, but some. So we now know that the education department did not stand up to the health people, that in some ways education might have had more of a say. We now know that 3 years later. The problem, and the problem again, Jacobson is about, is, as you said, we can only act in the present. We don't get to act on data we discover 3 years later. So one of the lessons of COVID is that there were a wide variety of interests involved, and we probably could have used a bigger table for a broader set of interests in making policy than we had. And here is what I can promise you when the next situation arrives. We will fix all the mistakes we made in COVID, and we'll make new ones that are just as bad.
You know, it's like they always say, you will always fix the mistakes that your parents made raising you while raising your own children, but you'll just screw them up in a completely different way, right? Like, I would just, and I'm sorry for monopolizing time, but I just want to add kind of one thing. I think one of the things that unfortunately, I think we're having a great discussion here. I think it's high-minded, and I think we're treating each other in a spirit of good faith, and we may have some disagreements, but we think that those disagreements are made in good faith. I think what unfortunately happened, and sometimes happens in these discussions in public sphere, which is why I think courts do have a place, is that they're not happening this way. And I think COVID was an example. You're right that maybe education should have done more. Maybe we should have had a better table. But in some places, and again, I don't want to paint everybody with the same broad brush, but in some places, in some situations, taking COVID vaccine was presented and kind of litigated in broad sense of the word, not on courts, but as a moral, like we're not taking as a moral failing as opposed to something scientific. I represented once an individual who was an employee of the university in the Midwest who was remote, even before COVID, who was remote, was never coming on campus, right? Was not interacting with anybody, could not infect anyone, and was fired because he declined to take a COVID vaccine, right? I'm sorry, that seems ridiculous, right? Ultimately, we lost the case because of Jacobson. The court said, well, Supreme Court had Jacobson until they overrule it. We, the lower courts, can do nothing about it. But this was not a medical judgment. This was not a kind of a public health judgment. This is purely a moral judgment. You're a bad person for not taking this vaccine, even though you can infect no one. That, I think, is inappropriate, right? That, I think, is unethical.
I remain suspicious of courts on this grounds. In part, there is rancor in the public. We need courts. Has anyone read Supreme Court opinions recently? A friend has a wonderful article, Trash Talk. The judges are as abusive to each other as anyone else in our society. That, yep, mistakes are going to be made. People on all sides in our climate. I mean, one of the things we know is that polemics get more clicks than this discussion. If either of us want to click, we know the insults to use. Indeed, I'm rather tempted to say, Greg, you want to improve your click rate? Here's what you need to call me. I'll call you this. And we'll get much more publicity than we're going to get. Here's what I think courts do well, and it may be your case is one of them I'd like to sit, and that is, one, when what the law does is it makes a segment of the population, particularly a segment of the population that is distinguished as being historically disfavored, makes them pay the price for the benefits enjoyed by the more favored part of the population. So if we look at something, Miranda warnings, give an example of this. And a lot of people say, well, why do we need Miranda warnings? I don't need Miranda warnings. I suspect most people here don't need Miranda warnings. Miranda warnings were developed as a general policy because African Americans, particularly in the South, were being beat up for confessions. This was a prophylactic. to prevent them. So where courts are really good is saying, here's what we're going to insist on. If you think, for example, banning abortion is a wonderful policy, we're going to make sure everybody in your state legislature who gets pregnant or impregnates anyone, that child comes to life. And we rather think that if that would happen, abortion will be a lot more liberal. We insist that everybody live by the same rules. Courts are very good about that. They're not nearly as good when the legislature, both in theory and in practice, insists that everybody lives by the same rules in substituting better rules.
Thank you. There was a question there in the back. Could you get your microphone, please?
Yeah. My name is Henry. I'm a law student here, one of Professor Dolin's former students. And my question was about, thank you, I needed that. So my question was about children, like Dr. Cimino-Fiallos talked about. Our legal system really values parental rights, but children don't have the ability to decide for themselves whether or not they would like the vaccine. So how do your arguments change based on vaccines for children who could potentially get sick and develop a disability, or even, get sick and die before they're old enough to make that choice for themselves?
Who wants to take that? Nicole?
So I think, I don't mean to keep harping on the HPV vaccine, but I think the HPV vaccine is a good example here, because this is something that if you get it when you're very young, it can prevent cancers later on in adulthood. And currently, the system is, if the parent doesn't consent, we don't give the vaccine. But children can decide to catch up on their vaccinations once they're adults. Unfortunately, that could be after an exposure occurs, could be after they're already infected with something. There's a very high bar for us to allege neglect of a child and call Child Protective Services and get the courts to force vaccination. That doesn't happen. I do my best as a physician to try to educate families. We have a lot of literature at Kaiser that we've worked very hard on to explain the negligible risk of most vaccines, the importance of the illnesses they prevent. I share stories like I did tonight about my children, and try to at least give people all of the information so that it is an informed consent. I like to talk about Australia when I talk about the HPV vaccine with patients and their parents. I like to talk about how they're on track to eliminate cervical cancer in the next decade if they continue their vaccination efforts, which we're not going to meet here in the United States quite yet. And so that's kind of the approach. But at this point, we do allow parents to make the decisions for their children in the setting of vaccines.
There's an old saying that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. I always hated that saying, but slippery slope argument is the last refuge of a scoundrel lawyer. So I'll take that. So I'm going to be a scoundrel lawyer. And look, and I take Dr. Cimino-Fiallos' point that, early intervention in some situations may make life better for that child, right? And the only people who can make that intervention are the parents. And and I even take the point that children are not, an extension of parental morality or religious beliefs or whatever. I take that. But like I said, refuge of a scoundrel lawyer. Where does that stop? Feeding children correctly and not letting them too much sugar or letting them too much screen time, right, nowadays, will also have immeasurably better outcomes down the line, right? In fact, if there's an addiction today that is really ruining people's lives, it's the screen time addiction. And kids are now learning it from, as soon as they can hold something in their hand, because that's stuff that keeps them quiet. And again, look, as one person on this panel without kids, it's easy for me to sit and criticize, saying like, why don't you just take care of your kids better, as opposed to like blah, 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 right? I don't know what I would do if I wanted to go out and I had like a 2-year-old or 5-year-old who would otherwise just scream. So it's easy for me like to chuck things from the sidelines, right? But the point is, it's a real problem. It's a health problem. Are we going to have government intervention and monitor, like, for example, how much screen time kids get, how much sugar they get? It sounds ridiculous, right? But it's not that far away from requiring, say, a vaccine for something that benefits only that child, as opposed to vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella that they can infect somebody else with, right? So again, I'm not saying we should definitely mandate vaccines or not. I'm just pointing out that the argument that's being advanced is potentially, if taken too far, problematic. And again, just asking you to recognize that there are trade-offs, including trade-offs on abilities of parents to raise their kids as they see fit, short of a child abuse.
Just a small point. Once again, absolutely right. Trade-offs. But all systems are systems of government regulation. So as of today, if I look into the window and I see you beating your child, I can legally enter and stop you from beating your child. If I see you feeding your child too much sugar, I cannot legally enter. All freedom depends on government regulation. So we're never talking more government regulation, less government regulation. We're talking this kind of government regulation versus that kind of government regulation. There is no escape from it.
There is no escape. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists with this excellent presentation, excellent discussion, Dr. Cimino-Fiallos, Professor Graber, Professor Dolin, also the members of the MedChi's Committee on Ethics and Judicial Affairs, Dr. Yana Torco-Corridi, who's there in the back, who helped put this together, our sponsors, Carol and Tom Allen of the annual lecture here, the Center for Healthy Maryland, MedChi, the University of Baltimore School of Law, staff, Amita and Lindy, who put it together. And also I see many leaders in the audience, and I really appreciate your participation both here and online. And thank you. Have a great evening. There will be a QR code posted to obtain your continuing medical education credit. Lindy, if you could post that, or Amita.
For those who are thinking of being a lawyer instead, Maryland, you have to do continuing medical education. Maryland has no lawyer continuing legal education.
Okay.
Which is why we keep citing case from 19th century.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.